All right, so as Julia said, I started Nikean Foundation. The initial thought process was about 5 years ago when I first heard Robin Carhart Harris speak about the potential for psilocybin treating various mental disorders, but specifically anorexia. My daughter is 27 years old now, has been hospitalized 3 times for her eating disorder. She's fortunately in the 3rd year of a psychiatry residency at the University of Toronto, where she hopes to actually treat people better than she was treated by the medical system. So this started out with, thanks. So this started out with a donation to Robin's organization, Imperial University, to start to prove the efficacy. Because back then, I didn't write $1 million check because I knew the stuff worked. I hadn't tried it myself. But after donating that money on a bet that maybe it worked, my daughter and I both started a journey with retreats outside of North America as well as with underground therapists, and we found tremendous value in it. So what started as trying to prove, is it effective, does it work, very quickly within a year migrated to, holy shit, this stuff works, right? How do we get this into people's hands? So the foundation's mission was, originally it was all about funding research. And then all this money in 2020 and 2021 started pouring into psychedelics, and we didn't need to fund the research anymore. The question as a foundation, because we have so much freedom in what we can do, the question for us is, what can we do that nobody else can do? Or that nobody else will do? So if you look at it as, first you prove effectiveness, then you need to legalize it, and then you need to give people access to it. We came to the conclusion that there was a component of this that was going to lift every aspect, which was education. And the problem with indulging in psychedelic education is that everybody's pushing something, or they're misinformed, or not totally informed. So if you were to ask any 100 people at this conference, what should you do if you're a personal healing journey? They're not going to know, 98 of them won't know what all of the molecules do, and they're all going to be trying to push their own solution. If you run a ketamine clinic, hey, ketamine's the way to go. If you've experienced MDMA yourself, you're going to say, hey, you've got to try MDMA. If you think 5-MeO-DMT is the way to go, then you're going to say that's the way. And by the way, 5-MeO-DMT is the way to go, just so y'all know. So we realized that we were uniquely positioned as a foundation. We are uniquely positioned that we know what all of the molecules do. We have exposure to all of the indications, and we're privately, philanthropically funded, so we don't have an agenda. So we can actually tell people, give them information, and be seen as an unbiased source. So we hit upon this idea of a storytelling project. Because everybody I know who tried psychedelics, including myself, started because they heard a story. Either they read a book and they read Michael Pollan's story, or a friend, in my case, a friend gave me mushrooms on a beach in Thailand, and my reaction was, holy shit, where has this been all my life? Nobody ever told me how amazing this could be. So we have this opportunity that private corporations won't indulge in. I mean, make no mistake about it. Public corporations and governments are some of the most selfish organizations on the planet. They are not out there to make your life better. They're out there to make money, and they're out there to get elected. Our mission as a foundation, and this is going to be true for all the foundations out there, activists, idealists, philanthropic organizations, we are out there to make the world a better place. Now, the way the world is structured, we need to have capitalism, we need to have commercial organizations to get all that money pouring in for scale to make the world a better place. So our role, activists, idealists, and philanthropists, is to provide a counterbalance, to fight the bastards who are trying to make money off of your illness. So our storytelling project in this iteration is we're collecting stories from people about how psychedelics have helped them transform in their lives. Because we're independent, people are willing to give us their stories. And they're willing to speak openly about which molecules, which indications, and how it's affected them in their lives. They're not worried that these stories are going to be used for commercial purposes. So that's our purpose as a foundation. And I have to say, there's two counterbalancing issues that we face right now. One, I have to say, is medicalization is the enemy. Okay? We are all traumatized children running around pretending that we're adults. Right? So medicalization is going to push treatment to those with diagnoses. And what's going to happen, because psychedelics and this kind of therapy can help absolutely everybody, it's going to create this massive wave of diagnoses and overdiagnoses. I mean, hell, we're already there, but it's going to get worse. And it's going to be forced into a system where profits can be extracted maximally from the population. So that's on one side the problem. The problem on the other side, if we didn't have that, is that if you take psychedelics without a trained guide, if your first time taking it is taking a handful and hoping that you're going to get better, holy shit, you're wrong. It's 50% of the people who do that are going to have terrible experiences, and they're going to go out and tell everybody, don't do this, it doesn't work. So how do we find that balance point between medicalization and the untrained use of psychedelics? Again, it's education. You all have to tell your stories. Start removing the stigma from psychedelic therapy, from psychedelics, and get the word out there that this works, but get the word out how to do it safely, how to do it effectively, how did you do it, what did you do wrong, what are you going to do right, and then offer them your advice on what to do next. All right, thank you.
Our next panelist is Tim SCHLIDT. Tim SCHLIDT is co-founder and partner at Palo Santo, a $50 million psychedelic-focused VC fund. Tim co-founded Palo Santo out of a long-running interest in advancing novel therapies for the treatment of mental health disorders and holds a deep passion for advancing psychedelic medicines in a safe, efficacious, and accessible manner. Prior to Palo Santo, Tim's career spans private equity investing and M&A advisory in the healthcare services and life sciences sectors at Madison Dearborn Partners and Greenhill & Company. Let's welcome Tim to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks for that. All right, talk about a counterbalance here. Here comes the vulture capitalist. I am going to grow horns out of my head halfway through this, by the way, so just get prepared. So I have to script my thoughts, so forgive me for looking down at pen and paper here. But like the introduction said, Tim SCHLIDT, co-founder and partner at Palo Santo. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of what I want to cover here, I always do like to give just a nice icebreaker, make this a little more personable, so I'm not a Chad finance bro here, just bloviating about boring finance topics. So favorite animal is always kind of an easy one. And so it's actually now 2. It used to be 1. So people who know me for a long time, it was the Bufalvarius toad, actually. They're lovely. So yes, so fawn is for endangered species, so do the synthetic version, not the organic one. And then the second one is a more recent one, again, endangered species list in venture capital, and it's unicorns right now in this marketplace. So that is the other one. Founders, please turn your companies into unicorns. We need the ROI right now in this market. But all jokes aside, as was hit on, co-founder, partner at Palo Santo. We're a venture capital fund focused exclusively on investing across the psychedelic ecosystem. I guess the way we view the world is this is sort of the world we're in. The FDA is a progressive institution that came about in the 50s and 60s at the behest of Eleanor Roosevelt, of all people, but there is a framework we need to work within there that it requires a lot of upfront investment. So for better or for worse, our view is that this is still a great Trojan horse way to get drugs to market. We recently announced the closing of our $50 million Fund 1 yesterday, actually. The press release just came out there, so thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we're really excited. What you didn't see is we actually invested all that in Canadian-listed psychedelic stocks, and all the money's gone. Now it's all, we don't know where it went, no clue, it just went down a black hole. But all jokes aside, we've deployed $25 million into the space, so far seeded some really early-stage companies that were overlooked and traditional sources of capital did not want to invest in, and that's where we think our value add is, and looking forward to deploying more over the coming years in this market. So I'm going to hit less on kind of the background of Palo Santo, and we can save the Q&A there and why we view this as the best approach. The way I steered my script was really more to just cover some big topics and themes and how I think we've seen the marketplace change, since we've really had a fundamental focus on how we do diligence. But what's been interesting is the macroeconomic environment has changed tremendously. If you've looked out your capital markets window, winter is no longer coming. I think it's already here, and it's a frozen tundra out there right now. So it's been interesting to introduce a macroeconomic backdrop that is really harsh into our analysis, and macro forecasting is notoriously difficult to make. So some of our rough heuristics have been, and kind of our rules of thumb that we've given to founders have been to have 18 to 24 months of cash runway to really weather this storm. So that's kind of a general rule, and it's been a lot of rockiness that it's tough to evaluate that. We're not a macro fund, but it's been an interesting market where all asset classes have really correlated. So that's a more recent motif. Another big one I do want to hit on, and I think this is a good segue, is a market change in valuation expectations amongst founders as well. Now that we really have had this precipitous fall from grace from the frothy years of 2020 and 2021, I do think there has to be a big reset in expectations, and really not pegging those expectations in any way to 21 and 20 in terms of where precedent financings were pricing out back then. So to give some data points there, if you look at the S&P Biotech ETF, the ticker is XBI, it's trading at around 2017 and 2018 levels, which is crazy to think that if you put money into biotech, just a broad basket back then, you're really no better off now, which is wild. But what that means for valuations is we think the more reliable precedent financings to look at are in that range. And what you can expect if you're a preclinical company is anywhere from probably 10 to the upper limit would be a $25 million pre-money valuation. And I think that's a market change from what we were seeing in 2021, but that does seem to corroborate with kind of the clearing price we're seeing out there with a lot of financings that have gotten done. So I just think that's a useful data point for founders, a big change we're seeing, and also kind of a data point on what is getting money in the door for folks raising capital. Two other quick things I want to hit, and then I think I'm going to run out of time here, is I do see that there's a bit of an echo chamber that's developed within psychedelics, that we kind of have this closed system. We're talking about our own internal issues, but the problem is if you look at the aggregate cost to develop one drug to get it all the way through to commercialization, that's north of $200 million. I think that was roughly the cost of developing Spravato within Johnson & Johnson. So if you total up all the money amongst the psychedelic funds, we're at roughly that number. So the capital to fund drug development in this space is not just going to come from the psychedelic universe. We're trying to build a bridge to the traditional life sciences world. And if you look out there, our internal data suggests, pulling from PitchBook, the 45 top life sciences funds have about $90 billion worth of dry powder just sitting on the sidelines. Within big pharma, it's $300 billion of balance sheet cash. But the way they evaluate opportunities oftentimes is very different from how we think about things internally, and there is a bridge that needs to be built to that world and better communication there. Last thing I'll mention, and then I'm going to run out of time, it's just interesting, one other thing that has a lot of bearing, a policy development on small molecule drug discovery and will affect psychedelics is the Inflation Reduction Act, which just passed in August. And I'm shocked that no one's talking about it. It's massively changed the incentive structure around wanting to invest in small molecule drug discovery, which is ultimately the subset of drug development that psychedelics sit in. So I'll leave it at that. That is kind of a more nuanced, boring policy discussion, but we can get into that more in the Q&A. So those are some recent themes I wanted to hit on, kind of an update on the marketplace, and looking forward to the Q&A and diving in further. So thank you, everyone.
We have one more speaker joining us on the stage, Patrick TRUCCHIO. Patrick is a managing director of equity research at H.C. Wainwright, whose research focuses on biotechnology, specifically on immunology, genetic medicines, and psychiatry. Patrick has 15 years of experience in sell-side equity research, including at BMO Capital Markets, Wells Fargo Securities, and Berenberg Capital Markets. Separately, Patrick is also an active member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the conference organizers for letting me speak. So I'm going to kind of give the public market view from the sell side perspective. So, as mentioned, I've been on the sell side for 15 years. Much of that time focused on, major companies in the consumer area, technology, pharma, and biotech. And most recently, over the last, several years, 5 years now, really taking a much deeper look at psychedelic medicine, psychoactive agents, and kind of where we see the space going from here. And this is kind of for me personally, it's been an interest of mine for more than 15 years. Kind of always had an interest in ketamine and the potential there and different mood disorders, kind of looking at different ways in applying ketamine with psychoactive and other psychoactive agents in therapy and kind of looking at the potential there. Over the last several years, as everyone knows, we've had a kind of first you had kind of a flood of capital come into the market, and then of course we've had this challenging macro environment that we've had over the last year and a half or so. Biotech, as a broad sector, entered a bear market in February 2021. So when we value the sector, we cover 10 of the larger companies that are involved in the space, and we're looking at it from both a bottom-up and a top-down perspective. So from a bottom-up perspective, we have to look at kind of the individual drugs, and then we have to look at kind of the development path, the indications, where these companies are taking the drugs, which markets, and then ultimately the path to market commercialization. And it was mentioned that it costs, some $200 million kind of to repurpose a medicine. For a new chemical entity, it could cost well more than that. So I think for our purpose, as we've kind of been evaluating these treatments, we're looking at kind of the path forward. From a top-down perspective, we see a $200 billion market in the U.S. developing. This is just purely based on the number of mental health clinics in the U.S., at the time of the launches that we see perhaps coming as, for this next kind of set of medicines, MDMA and PTSD, psilocybin in depression, and others to come in the 2025 timeframe. And as we look forward from there, what we see is, something like 13,000 or more mental health clinics that perhaps could be altered to, or kind of where you can kind of see where they can be delivering these medicines, and then a certain proportion of psychiatrists and therapists and others would have to come in and then deliver the medicines to patients. And ultimately, that's how we're looking at kind of if it's, something like 10 or 15% of Americans with mental illness, mental health disorder getting treatment, you see this very large ramp. And of course, we hear from a lot of institutional investors. We talk to a lot of institutional investors who look at this market, and they're starting now to see the potential, but I think there's still some questions. And where those questions most often come in is areas around IP. So it's the first thing that comes up is how is this market going to last? You're modeling this out to 2040, but we don't think it's going to be, for some of these, for some of the psilocybin compounds, some of the others, we don't see it maybe having exclusivity past 2030, particularly in the U.S. So for the way that we kind of have to approach this when we're talking to investors is kind of outline, first and foremost, what the differentiation is versus what could be a genericized market, how the company itself is funded through not just proof of concept, but real sort of phase 2 data, phase 2 being kind of that first time you'd have the drug in patients, and looking at the efficacy and seeing what you see there and the safety, of course. And I think one of the things that we try to focus on as well, because a lot of feedback we get is, there aren't as many catalysts. So investors in the public markets are going to be looking for what are the next catalysts? Why should I be risking my capital getting involved here? And for us, I mean, we've outlined, over the next 12 to 18 months, there's no less than 24 of these catalysts that we see. We're going to have a lot of early stage phase 1 data with short acting and longer acting psychedelics and novel psychedelics at the end of this year, going into next year. Hopefully, we're going to have the advisory committee for MDMA and PTSD. That's FDA, calls a committee, basically discusses a drug, discusses, what are the pros and cons of this drug, and then asks the committee, do you think we should approve it? And I think it's going to be the first time we really get a view of how the FDA looks at, psychoactive agents being administered in this paradigm of psychotherapy, which is not something the FDA is normally involved in. And then, as we look at, the future and how do we bridge this gap? So we covered the 10 names that I mentioned at the outset. There's around a $20 billion valuation gap. And so the question is, well, how do you close that gap? And I think over the next, 12, 18 months, what we need to see is we need to see some of these data points continue to come out and point to the really strong efficacy that we've seen. It's clear that these drugs can help patients if administered in the correct set and setting. So I think it's just a matter of actually demonstrating that in clinical development, in the regulatory framework, where, you could then start to see, okay, we'll get this build out of this very substantial, platform, and ultimately we will get to scale that I think some folks still on the public equity side are still a bit skeptical of. So we're very hopeful for the space. We think it's really important. We think it's to us, it's the most important industry that we cover. It's the most important area for humanity when you look at the level of mental health disorders and the level of depression, anxiety in the population, particularly through the pandemic. So from our side of things, we're doing everything we can to kind of keep folks informed, publishing primers, as the data is published in publications like JAMA. We're making sure we're getting folks aware of this so that they could see that, these drugs are really effective in all different areas: alcohol use disorder, depression, anxiety. It's looking like anorexia and a few other indications as well. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Let's move to some questions.
Sorry.
And water.
Liquid LSD in there, so.
I'd like to start with a broader question. Maybe this is a good one for you, Tim. Perhaps you can give us a bit of an overview what, in your view, is the right capital for the different business models along the value chain, and where do you really see the role of venture capital?
Yeah. In right capital, in terms of type of investor, is kind of the question. I think in the early days, psychedelic funds have definitely demonstrated more of an appetite to take on preclinical risk, where a lot of traditional life science sources have not. So in the beginning, I think that those have been largely the funders. And when you look again at the dry powder psychedelic funds, they are able to do that. Once companies get into the clinical stage, it's twofold. The capital needs are far larger. The cost of a phase 2 study is tens of millions of dollars. Patrick, you may know the Compass phase 2, but my guesstimate was 40, 50 just for that, and a phase 3 is going to be even larger. So again, back to that bridge to the traditional life sciences world, eventually you do have to tap the RTWs, the BVFs, the RA Capitals of the world. And so when we evaluate an investment, we oftentimes look at it through that lens of, is this something that those folks are willing to fund, up the capital markets value chain as they get to later stages. So I guess it changes over time. The tough bridge that a lot of people have been trying to, or the tough gap that a lot of people have been trying to bridge is really that phase 1 gap. A lot of traditional life sciences players won't touch something until at least a phase 1 readout, if not a phase 2 now in this marketplace. But that can still be, upwards of $10 million to get that done. So that has been a gap I think a lot of people have been trying to close, but hopefully that gives a little bit of a picture on how we think about things, of how will those folks have appetite, and who you want at different stages of development, preclinical versus clinical.
Mm-hmm. And staying on that topic, I'm also curious if you can talk a little bit about how the timelines that you look at as a venture capitalist align with the timelines of these really long clinical trials.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, from an IND filing to approval, that's about a 7-year process to get a drug all the way through the clinic and to commercialization. A lot of VC funds are kind of bounded by a 10-year investment horizon. But I do think the nuance is once you get a phase 2 readout, there's a lot more room to maneuver for some sort of a liquidity event. So biotech is unique in that you can still be pre-revenue, but see liquidity on investments. And for a long time, in the frothy years, there was a path to IPO even after a phase 1. I think GH Research was the really kind of surprising dark horse for a long time that kind of came out of nowhere. They had a phase 1 readout. I think it was 8 representative patients, and did a massive IPO with kind of the traditional life sciences funds. That has moved later in this market, but still a phase 2 really de-risks an asset tremendously, and the odds of getting that drug to approval go up markedly. So there's potentially a path to IPO, not now, I'd say, but maybe in the next 2-3 years. M&A, that door certainly opens up far more to be acquired by big pharma. And like I mentioned, there's $300 billion in balance sheet cash out there across the 20 largest pharmaceutical companies, or royalty milestone type deals. Licensing opportunities are another opportunity there. So there are opportunities to see liquidity even before you start generating revenue within biotech that do fit within the investment time horizons we have.
And Patrick, what would you say, which business models are most compelling for public markets financing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the companies that have kind of the highest quality management teams with great scientists behind them that have outlined a very clear clinical development path for whichever compound that they're developing, and then can kind of talk through the differentiation of that approach, and then kind of explain to investors, this is why we think ultimately our drug is going to be effective in these different areas, and this is the kind of the best path forward for us and for you and to invest with us, to know that you're going to get a good return on that investment. Ultimately, for the kind of this first sort of round of companies, they focused on the existing literature, and that's typical of biotech. So normally you'd have a lot of work done at the academic side, and then that would get passed along to entrepreneurs, and then that gets moved through preclinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 development, ultimately commercialization if successful, and that's a very small proportion that are successful. But in this case, I think the companies did the right thing. They looked at the existing literature. Some of the academic work that's been done since 2000, especially, I think, has been highly instrumental. So just sort of looking at the data that's been generated in depression, in anxiety with psilocybin, it made sense that psilocybin was going to be a focus initially for some of these companies, and LSD and some of the existing ones. And then as biotech does it, we'll work from there.
So we hear a lot about the increasing amounts of investor funding, which is great news. But Sanjay, I would love for you to expand a little bit on the role of philanthropy. You mentioned that, this has changed your personal priorities for your foundation. Is that something that you also observe in the broader donor community? Is there crowding out, perhaps, even?
Well, I should disclose here that, I have the foundation, which is purely philanthropic, but I also have investments in about 15 psychedelic companies. Every one of those investments was private at the time I made it. In fact, had a big fight with one of them who wanted to go public, Canadian exchanges.
Don't do that.
It was like, if you go public, I'm pulling out all my money. Because that was a sign to me that you're in it for the money, not for actually creating value, not even for the betterment of society, but just creating real value and charging for that value. So I would say that I don't think I know any philanthropists who don't also have private investments. There's too much value created and money to be made in this space from delivering genuine, good products to ignore it, because the philanthropists, we made our money in capitalistically. So I can't ignore that opportunity. But so we fulfill a role that's more like angel investors. We're not looking for the 100x returns. We're perfectly happy with 2 to 3, and quite often just getting our money back, so then we can put that money into something else. And so it tends to be in that value change that Josh showed this morning. It's not in drug development, right? But it's in every stage after that: clinical deployment, technology, infrastructure, and education.
There are a lot of questions from the audience around care delivery infrastructure and who would fund that. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to speak to that.
You mean delivery of care?
Yeah, clinics.
You know, one of the things I don't understand about the whole drug development boom that's going on is, isn't the money going to be made by people actually delivering the care? Like, shouldn't that be where all the money is going, and have a few people, right, just working on the drugs we have work? So I think as these drugs get legalized, and honestly, that's the tipping point. When MAPS gets to the crescendo of this act, and the FDA legalizes MDMA for PTSD, you're going to see the floodgates just open on funding from the large biotechs, the $300 billion of capital that's just sitting on the sidelines. It's going to come pouring in, and I believe it's going to come pouring into clinical care.
I guess I'll add to that a bit. I mean, for a lot of drugs, a drug gets approved, and then there's a clinical infrastructure to prescribe or administer it, but there's still quite a bit of money to be made in the biotech realm. I think what folks have struggled with in the investing universe is it's kind of a dirty secret that traditional brick and mortar clinics, it's tough to really ink a profit out of those, for better or for worse. And I think everyone would love to fund that, but you're also backed into a corner by your LPs and target investment returns and everything, for better or for worse. And so kind of that brick and mortar, it almost can become more like a real estate play. Doesn't always lend well to venture investing. And there have been some notable case studies, prior to the emergence of Field Trip and others. Actify was a chain of ketamine clinics that went under, quite frankly. They tried to navigate going from out-of-network to in-network, and there's sort of this trough of compressing margins. You try to make up for it in volume, and they couldn't, and eventually imploded. Now, I think people are starting to figure out more how to eke a profit out of that, but that's always been kind of a cautionary tale in a lot of ways. Now, one aspect of care delivery that I do think is interesting, I mean, you're certainly seeing the emergence of telehealth, but also a lot of squeamishness around that. The Mind Blue model, and other models, those give us a lot of pause on whether that would have some sort of a regulatory crackdown. I know Journey Clinical was on stage earlier today. I think that's a much safer model where it can be profitable, scalable, but also safe for patients.
I think from the delivery side for biotech, pure biotech specialists, it's going to be pretty hard to kind of rationalize that investment on the public side. But I think for kind of your healthcare generalist, or your sort of, even someone who specializes more in hospital and kind of care and things like that, I think it might be kind of easier. Once there is a kind of a clear path to commercialization, you start seeing revenues ramping and profits ramping. And then I think from that side, I think that's when you'll start to see more money come in.
Mm-hmm. And to maybe this is a good one for you. What are some of the biggest gaps that you're excited to fill in the space? And what are maybe gaps that no one's excited to fill that might be underfunded?
Yeah. Well, I can't give away the secret sauce is the thing. It's,
Can I try answering that?
Please.
It's in accessibility. One of the big challenges we're going to see is how to deliver group care and deliver protocols that are, like the initial MAPS protocol for PTSD is very involved. Lots of therapists, lots of sessions, and they had to do it that way because that's the only way to prove it works to the level that's going to be required for legalization. But psychedelics work in much smaller doses, many fewer sessions, and what I haven't seen yet is really good protocol development for group access to psychedelic therapy, and we'll happily fund that if it starts to come out.
Yeah. I think I'll agree with that. And I was actually surprised to recently learn, I mean, the FDA will be receptive if you have group therapy, as long as you keep that consistent across a trial. Group therapy is feasible, and you can have that on the label. I don't have a great answer. I think what we're really juggling right now is the space has gotten very saturated. There's a lot of companies out there developing new chemical entities, and we're the first movers really advantaged, and it's best to steward those along. I'd say that's been where we've veered internally, and we've got a lot of the fund reserves for follow-on capital so that we can continue funding existing companies in the portfolio. And I think that's a really critical aspect of who you select as an investor. But there, we have played with the idea of, on one end, you kind of have companies starting to enter the clinical phase, and it's far more expensive, and you have to bridge that gap, versus can you have a basket of companies, can you construct the right portfolio where it's really tough to know for early stage preclinical assets what's going to be a winner and what isn't. Our preclinical models just don't translate well, but there is I think the bet is that whoever does strike oil there will hit it big. And so can you have a portfolio if you don't know, but whoever is a winner is a big winner, and you kind of go in assuming naivete. But I know that's not the best answer, but I think that's something we played with internally of, do you keep going and making a lot of bets on early preclinical companies, or do you kind of keep it with the later stage opportunities, existing ones in the portfolio?
We've spoken a lot about drug discovery and clinical trials. There's a question from the audience around what some of your favorite non-pharma related psychedelic investments are.
Talked a lot, so
Yeah, so I would say for us, our focus is mostly on the drug development side. But I think some of the areas that we get a lot of questions are around these digital therapeutics and kind of the applicability of digital to this space and how that could be relevant. And I think there's kind of multiple areas where digital makes sense, just in terms of care delivery, making care kind of more broadly available to more patients. And then in other areas, maybe even developing things like digital biomarkers, looking at kind of how can you kind of attach a digital phenotype to a patient to figure out when is the best time maybe to treat them, or maybe who is best fit to benefit from the treatment. And so I think it's for us, it's I think we're just starting to see it. I think it's harder though, at least on the public side, because there aren't as many of those types of companies out there. It's harder to kind of attribute value to that part of it, but it's mostly digital where we get the questions.
And maybe moving even one step further away from the clinical trials, there's also a question around what's happening in the business ecosystem for the advancement of psychedelics outside the medical model for wellness and wholeness. Anyone would like to speak to that?
Well, not enough, right? We need to see a lot more activity outside that, but again, it's going to require legalization, right? There's only so many retreats in Costa Rica that we can have, although there are some great ones. But what's it going to take in North America?
Yeah, I think it is tough because you then enter an arena where you're state compliant, but you're not federally compliant, and then a lot of the issues seen in cannabis start to emerge. And so there is this debate of, do we want to repeat the cannabis model? Was that successful, albeit more recreational than, I think as these legalize, it'll be more in a clinical context. But it does make it tough to invest in the LP base, who's willing to take on that risk, and the sources of institutional capital really start to dry up. Whereas in the biotech arena, I think where the focus has been is just purely from a funds flow perspective. If you have DEA licenses to manufacture and research Schedule I compounds, you can work with them legally. There's no, you don't run into cannabis style issues. And then once you get a drug approved, the DEA does defer to the FDA on those matters. So by default, a compound has to get rescheduled since there's a known medical use case. So again, I don't have a great answer. Those are some of the issues there. I certainly know of investors willing to take on that risk. It hasn't been one we've quite had the appetite for, just looking at how this has played out in cannabis. But I think you're seeing growing interest, and there are certain jurisdictions as well where, outside of the U.S., where they may make these legal sooner than expected, that folks are poking around.
From the drug developer side, I think that would enter the realm of maybe things that are done off label, and so I think for drug developers, they would probably avoid talking about that. But certainly that's a possibility and could be part of the ultimately the market that develops as these drugs get approved.
And one other quick thing I think is what will be tough is if you have an FDA-approved medication, there's at least a hope of having payers reimburse for it, whereas in these legalized markets, it's going to be out of pocket. It'll be very expensive, and so while we certainly love and we support at Palo Santo legalization, I don't know how accessible that will be to a lot of patients as compared to being able to collect outcomes, both primary and secondary, through a trial, have post-market surveillance, demonstrate that to payers, and really have the hope, and we do have confidence that many of these will eventually be reimbursed when viewed in the context of a value-based care framework. So you do run into accessibility issues as well.
All right, I think we are going to squeeze in one more question. Tim, you mentioned cannabis, which perfectly relates to another question for Patrick and Tim. How do you think the investment community views cannabis versus psychedelics?
So from my discussions, I think there's a little bit of confusion around it, just in terms of the kind of path to approval, drug development. On the psychoactive agent psychedelic side, clearly these compounds are going to have to go through at least in our view, have to go through kind of the traditional FDA kind of pathway. Cannabis, I think, is probably more of a, kind of a question of a political question and getting that federal kind of acceptance. So I think it is going to be different. I think the way that the psychedelics are administered will be different. And ultimately, I think the investor groups are also different.
Yeah. Ditto, if there's anything more to add to that. But I mean, two totally different arenas, I'd say.
Okay, great. So let's close on that. Thank you very much.